Good morning, Minister. Order, order. And can I welcome you and what will probably be our valedictory session, notwithstanding any sudden events that might take us by surprise. Just before I start with the question, can I just put on record our appreciation of both your willingness to attend the committee, those of your other ministers in the department and indeed officials when appropriate. We haven't always seen eye to eye, but I wouldn't question your willingness to come and respond to our inquiries, and we are duly appreciative of that. Just before I start with my questions, if you could just introduce yourself for voice transcription purposes.
I'm Vince Cable. I'm Secretary of State for Business, Innovation and Skills.
I'm Martin Donnelly. I'm the Permanent Secretary of the Department.
I'm Howard Orme. I'm the Director General for Finance and Commercial at BIS.
Thanks very much. We are addressing the mid-year review, and it does list a number of key achievements for 2014-15. What's the main thing you would like to see the department achieve before the next spending review?
Well, I think it's the next spending review is imminent, actually,
yes.
So there isn't a great deal of opportunity.
No, well, it gives you an opportunity
yes, indeed.
to...
But essentially, I think it's consolidating the big overarching framework that we've established, which is the industrial strategy and the work we've done in partnership with business on key sectors of the economy. And I think within that, several specific areas where I think we have made a massive difference. One is in training through the expansion, improvement of apprenticeships. I think the next is in innovation with the establishment of the Catapult network. And the other is in relation to business finance with the work of the business bank, and I'd like to see all of those extended and strengthened.
Thanks. What do you think the biggest challenge is?
Well, I think you've hinted at it already, that within a few months the next government, whoever it is going to be faced with the continuing issues around the deficit. And I think the big challenge for the department will be making the case in government for the fact that many of the things that we do, particularly areas like apprenticeships and innovation, have extraordinarily high returns to the economy, that they are competing with other claims on public finance. And the biggest challenge will be to make that case.
I think we can say that whilst we may sometimes disagree on the outcomes and occasionally policies as well, in that respect the committee will be totally in support and agreement with you and do its best within the remit of its work to pursue that. But can I just come on to a element of the report, the staff survey, and obviously this is a matter for concern, although it does demonstrate a marginal improvement from last year in terms of morale and measured by the different criteria in the survey. But if I can quote one part of it, only 50% of the respondents in the staff survey believed that, quote, the actions of senior managers are consistent with the department's values. That's not exactly a great endorsement of the staff. How would you describe the department's values, and why do you think the staff believe that the behaviour, or so many of the staff believe the behaviour is inconsistent with them?
Well, I'll ask the Permanent Secretary to develop the answer, but I think I would start by saying that we've been trying to achieve a lot more in the department in some of the areas I've been describing to you, while making 50% administrative savings since 2010, and that has clearly been very difficult, and working practices have had to change, some jobs have had to go, and it would be amazing if staff were completely content with the changes to which they have had to adapt. But I'm sure you want to add to that.
Yes, overall, I've been very pleased with the staff survey results. They highlight areas that we've got more to do, but looking over the last 4 years, they've consistently improved. There's a very clear sense that the staff understand the organisational purpose, the work that we're doing, and that they've got the tools to do it. There are some issues, and one of them is how staff feel. There are certainly continuing issues about pay levels, and there are also issues about management and how staff perceive that as being done. To deal with that, we're doing several things. We've introduced compulsory unconscious bias training for all managers. We've got Professor Binna Kindola in to do several very well-received sessions to make sure that all of us in management positions understand what we're doing. We're looking again at our rigorous system of appraisal, and we do need to appraise people effectively. And we're also doing some anonymised surveying of staff to check that we're really picking up their concerns. And I and my senior colleagues have meetings with small groups to make sure that we're listening to our staff, because they do a tremendous job. And as the Secretary of State said, we're significantly smaller than we were 5 years ago, and there's been no fall off in the workload.
Quite frankly, your response sounded rather complacent. If I actually look at 3 areas there, I feel that change is managed well in the department. There is a drop from last year, admittedly only 1%, but it is a drop. The department keeps me informed about matters that affect me, again a small drop there. I have the opportunity to contribute my views before decisions are made that affect you, a more substantial drop there, all from pretty low levels anyway. It would seem that you and the staff really aren't singing from the same hymn sheet on this, and it would seem that it is about the process of managing change that I suppose inevitably is going to cause most concern. But according to the ratings that you are getting from your own staff, you're actually getting worse at doing it than better.
No, I don't think that's a fair assessment of the situation.
Well, with respect, it's the assessment that your review and report brings out.
Well, this is an annual survey, and the people doing it themselves say that 1% or so movements aren't very statistically significant. If you look at the overall engagement, it has continued to rise. I think that that is a big positive. We're aware that staff are working under pressure. We've done a lot over the last year to improve management systems, and we're not complacent about this. We've introduced our Management Matters approach. We've made sure that whistleblowing systems are up to the best standards in government, not least given our wider responsibilities for them. And we make sure that everyone in management is very clear of their responsibilities to support staff in the work that they do. And that comes out in the pulse surveys that we do throughout the year with our staff. And that's the feedback that we're getting. There's certainly more to do, and staff in some areas do feel under a lot of pressure, and I'm concerned about that. But we are delivering effectively, and there is a real feeling that the department knows what it's doing, why it's there, and is enthusiastic to deliver effectively. And I have to report that.
Well, can I just come back to the thrust of my original question? What are the values of the department? Why do you think the staff do not think managers are living up to them?
Well, our values are very simple. We commit to each other's success. We focus on what matters most, and we empower colleagues to deliver. And we make clear that we're doing all that in an environment that respects people's personal as well as professional lives. So we've worked very hard on our diversity, and in gender diversity terms, we've got a balanced senior team. We've got more to do on BME and other issues, but we're very focused on those because it's important to build the sort of department that we want to be. We've done training of all of our senior leaders around telling stories about being more personal, and this is responding to a staff need for more openness, and we're getting positive feedback on it. And as I say, I and all my senior colleagues talk regularly to colleagues at all levels because we see our job as making their jobs easier. So I have to say, taking the department as a whole, all the feedback we get is that we are going in the right direction. I understand your concern, but looking at the people survey as a whole, it's consistently moving upwards, and while there's more to do, we believe that we are living out the values that make us a successful department.
Could I suggest that perhaps you do a survey of your staff's agreement with the response that you've given to this committee, and we'll analyse that next time?
I'll send it round, Chair, and ask people to comment. They're usually pretty straightforward, and I'll happily share it with you.
Okay, could I come on to Caroline now?
Clearly, as we've already highlighted, the department's facing now a period of some uncertainty as we go into the forthcoming election. So what I'd really like to know is, what are the areas of spending that you see have to be preserved at all costs, despite whatever the outcomes?
Well, I'm tempted to say all of it, but that would be a rather unhelpful and somewhat mechanical answer. But actually, if there were any low-hanging fruit, it's been plucked long ago. I would start by saying that we went through a very tough exercise in the beginning of this Parliament. We had to make some extremely difficult decisions. You remember the issues around student tuition fees, for example. But we have managed, despite a considerably smaller budget, to do a lot more. Now, in terms of forward-looking, I would have said that there were certain areas, particularly innovation and science. I think it would be an absolute travesty if these things were to be cut. Our own estimates were that if we are to be internationally competitive in areas like innovation, we probably need to be spending about double what we are doing at the moment. So, I mean, it's not a question of cuts, but doing more. The science budget has been protected in cash terms, and I think there would be sort of near outrage if that were changed. So I think those are key areas. I think adult skills, because everything business is now telling us is that we've moved on from the financial crisis, and as the economy keeps growing, the biggest problem area is skills. So I would have found it very difficult to see, with the best will in the world, how you could make much savings in that area while preserving our fundamental economic role.
And are you all in agreement? Does anyone have anything to add?
Sorry?
Are you all in agreement? Does anyone have anything to add?
It's obviously not for me to comment on political choices, but I am strongly in agreement with what the Secretary of State said about the evidence that there is, which we will certainly be continuing to put forward, of the importance of investing in these areas which lead to sustainable growth over time.
So, Secretary of State, when we sit here, when us or our successors sit here this time next year, and you or your successor is sat in that chair, what are the key outcomes that you would like to see being reported from this year's spending?
Well, I'll try and abstract from the party politics of it, because
Yes.
all the parties have a different approach. But I would argue very strongly that the things that we do, which are almost entirely about supporting long-term growth and productivity in the economy, should be a priority area. And obviously there are particular things that you can criticise or things that could be done better, no doubt, but that is what we're about. And I've always taken issue with the idea that you have protected areas of government which may have very little relationship to the long-term success of the economy. So I think that's one big issue, and I'm in my party political capacity, I would argue that we need a better mixture of tax to spending cuts, because if the burden of deficit reduction falls almost entirely on spending, it will do a lot of damage.
So we've already talked about, you've already spoken about the low-hanging fruit and how you don't see that there's much more capacity for making those cuts. I mean, are there any further areas where you've identified savings can be made without actually compromising any of the core business activities?
Well, there are activities we do which are not directly related to growth, but which have what you might call a progressive social function. And we have maintained, despite all the pain around university finance, we have maintained the system of student support, of grants and student loans. Now that's designed to help low-income students when they go to university, and there will be an argument about how that can be preserved, but that isn't directly growth related. That's part of our kind of social function. I think that would be one big area that there will be a lot of fighting over, whoever is in the government.
Yes,
Just follow up on this. Looking at some of the detailed information we've been provided and the breakdown of expenditure, there's been a very significant increase in capital expenditure versus resource expenditure, and the projections going forward show that set to continue. Is that sustainable in the long term, do you think?
It should be. I mean, again, I'm arguing partly as an individual here rather than the voice of government, but I've always taken the view that capital spending should be treated quite differently from current spending and should not be treated as part of the deficit. I mean, there is an argument for productive capital expenditure which produces a return to the economy on its own merits. So I think our government has succeeded within its own definitions of deficit spending, has increased capital relative to current spending, and I think that is healthy. But I think there is a strong argument for productive capital spending on its own merits, and I would want to see that continue.
Did you want to follow up?
The other issue I would underline in this area, as I imagine you will be aware, is sometimes the capital resource line can be a little arbitrary when it comes to delivering the services. We're very aware of that, and going forward we will continue to make the case for the right level of resource to ensure that we get the full benefit from the capital facilities that we need for the reasons that the Secretary of State has given.
I mean, a good example is apprenticeships. I think the National Audit Office came out with the calculation, it wasn't ours, that for every £1 that's invested in apprenticeships, there is £18 of return to the national economy. I mean, it's a no-brainer to argue on that basis that you should be treating it as an investment and expanding it. But under government conventions, it's treated as current spending, like spending on health service and benefits, which...
It's an interesting area because I was going to ask about that specifically as well, because clearly you don't want to get into the party politics of it all, but fundamentally there is a bit of a bidding war going on in terms of apprenticeships, who can provide more and who can raise the standards faster and so on and so forth. And the reality of the party politics is that apprenticeships are so popular and all the parties are competing to present plans for even more of them. Isn't that going to put great pressure on other budgets? And I mean, looking at the breakdown of spending, and the chunk of spending taken up by the Skills Funding Agency as opposed to HoC and other areas is greater than it would have been 4 years ago. Do you think that's likely to be able to continue to grow?
Well, I think you're right to say that there is a danger that it's simply because apprenticeships are particularly salient and all the parties are signing up to it, and for good reason. Mm-hmm. It's a good decision that cuts are made in less visible areas which are nonetheless damaging. If I take the FE sector, for example, which performs an enormously valuable function, it has different mandates. I mean, part of its work, and some of the more innovative work in FE colleges, is by developing apprenticeships, but they also do a lot of work with teenagers who have failed to do well at school and who are coming back to do maths and English and basic vocational training, which are not classified as apprenticeships, and it would be unfortunate if that were to be sacrificed to pay for the apprenticeships. And similarly, adult education and lifelong learning performs an extremely important function, which I've tried to defend. But so I think we need to be careful, whoever's in government, this is not a party point, that the kind of headline issues like apprenticeships, which we all believe in, are not funded at the expense of other things which are less glamorous, less sexy, but nonetheless are valuable to the economy.
Can I just come back to your early comments about your approach to the distinguishing between capital and, if you like, current or resource spending? Does the Chancellor agree with your approach?
No, I don't think he does.
Thank you. Can I bring in Anne?
Yes, just on to the issue of major projects. Your mid-year review stated that the Department has a strong reputation for project delivery. Yet of the 12 projects which you've listed in the review, only one has a green risk status, which is actually, ironically, the Green Investment Bank. But two have amber red. So I just wonder what are the causes of concern, particularly for the two which are amber red, which is further education, 24 plus learning loans programme, and the ICR monetisation.
Project. Do you want me to cover this? Yeah, if we go, but basically, I'd expect major projects of complexity of this size to have an amber rating during their time. It's not a negative, given the complexity and the scale of the changes that these are on. So I just want to say that yes, of course, we'd like to have green, but in major projects, typically they're when you've actually completed them. On further education 24 plus, there were two elements that were flowing up, which have now been resolved. One was some thought about whether the system would be ready on time, and indeed it was. So that risk was removed. And then the second one was it didn't work in higher apprenticeships, and I think we recognised that and changed the policy. So 24 plus learning allowance programme is now completed.
No, is it back to an amber rating then? Would you say? Is it back to an amber rating?
Well,
or is it now complete?
What it will do, we'll go through a final gate 5, they call it, which is when you completely close down the programme.
Yes.
At that time, it will return to something like an amber green, I would expect.
Right. Okay.
The other one was the ICR monetisation.
Yes.
Well, in order to deliver that, a number of stars need to align. Not only the deliverability through the student loan company, but also for us to be able to get the right type of classification for the ONS, so it works, and also to find a way of handling the interest rate cap, which is quite a difficult thing to work. And then at the end of that, we've got to find somebody who's willing to pay an acceptable price. So aligning all of those in one go is currently not the case. We don't plan to do it before the next Parliament, and therefore the amber red reflects that.
Okay, so can I just ask how you're tackling the red part of that review, and what is the timescale that we would expect the risk to be decreased?
Yeah. Well, the deliverability side, there's a programme with the student loan company to make sure that the better information that you provide as a student loan company about on the book that you're selling, the better value you get for it. So there's a continuous improvement process to do that. So we're using the time to strengthen that.
I mean, I think the concern for the committee, Mr. Orme, is that this part of the loan book was considered the one with utterly the lowest level of potential risk, and was not considered to be difficult. I realise it's not a large amount of money in total, but I mean it does strike me as rather odd that we're having all these difficulties over a project of about £28 million in value.
I have always thought that this is going to be difficult to pull off. As I say, you've got to have not only the ability to do it, and this is a big transaction. It's got to go into a market at the right time to be able to get the value that makes it value for money.
I think the committee appreciates that, but given that the stock exchange is, as at this week, a historic high, are we ever then going to see a time when it will be right to sell it into the market in a reasonable period of time, say in the next year or two?
Well, I would like to speculate on how markets will develop, but there are scenarios and windows where it would prove to be value for money.
I think it would be helpful to the committee if the department could come back to us with some information about where that project is and how you are intending to resolve the current amber red rating on it, because I'm not entirely certain that I've got an assurance from you this morning about it. I appreciate it may not be something that you're personally dealing with, but I think we would like to know what realistic prospect there is of getting onto the market, if given the fact that the stock exchange is at such a high level and you can't get on it just now. When is it ever going to be on the market?
I think, to be fair to the officials, I made a political judgment that we should not proceed with the sale of the student loan book on the grounds that there was no clear value for money in doing so. But, of course, circumstances might change.
Okay.
Could I also just add to that? We will, of course, come back to you with an update. It is quite complex from a data side, but there is also the issue of interest rates. So it's rather more interest rates than state of the stock market.
Right, okay.
And we will not compromise on value for money, as has been made clear.
Okay, thank you.
Mike, I think you wish to come in with a supplementary on this subject.
Because my experience as a project manager, there are two things here. There's a risk register, which would identify the potential risks to a project, and then there's the status of the project itself. Now, are we saying that the project itself is rated as amber, or are we saying that there are risks associated with it which are identified as amber? Because the two would be very different.
I think, yes. I think we are satisfied with the project and the way it's been conducted entirely. This is not an issue about the project management of the process itself. It's the inherent difficulty, as I say, of making all these things line up. And until we are able to go to the market with a definite proposition, we will not know what the response of the market is actually going to be. We've only done soundings. So I think most of the amber red is in the uncertainty about whether all of these conditions can be met at the same time, as opposed to any issue with any element of the programme itself.
Because I'd be very concerned if your attitude to an amber rating of the status of the project was as lax as you laid out.
Well, I don't think it's that. All of the individual work streams are progressing to plan, but in any nature of a market deal, I don't think I've seen a market deal programme which has had anything less than an amber red status up till the point in which you can say we've achieved value for money, and then you go. So please don't interpret this as any complacency at all. This has been conducted under the brief that we've been given politically, but it's been conducted very seriously.
Thanks, Robin.
I wanted to move on to the disabled students allowance and some of the disabled students allowance DSA changes, and some of the I think very welcome the fact that major changes were put off. And that we saw the announcement from Greg Clark last September that said that they were going to be put off. But the mid-year review states that £25 million will be saved in 2015-16 as a result of changes to DSA. And the equality impact assessment suggested that students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds would be more affected than other groups. What's the department doing to ensure that those students aren't hit hardest by the proposals?
Well, I'll just give a political answer and then ask officials to develop it. I mean, a lot of thought was given to this. It wasn't just an arbitrary decision. It wasn't the elimination of the programme. It is just that it had been there a long time. Certain practices were just assumed, and it was felt that we had to go very carefully through all the complex support arrangements in order to make sure they were being done properly, and did so and listened to the various stakeholder groups and responded to them. In the event, as you will know, there is now a judicial review which has been issued, and obviously we have to wait for that and respond legally when we hear the rulings. But on the practical side of it, I don't know.
Yes, it is, as you know, a complex and obviously very important area for a large number of people. So we did extend the period of consultation until I think the 20th of February, so it's only just completed. We're now in the process of looking at all the responses from stakeholders. The new system won't begin for anyone until the 1st of September, and we'll be careful about that. There's also the need for further engagement in relation to the non-medical help area. And changes there, I think we said, won't apply until the following academic year, to give us time to get that right. And we're obviously doing the equality analysis and so on. But because of the legal proceedings position, it's not possible to go any further than that at the moment. But we are looking very carefully at all of the submissions we've received on this subject.
I mean, it certainly seems to be something where it's caused a great deal of concern. I represent one of the fastest growing universities in the country, which has a very high proportion of disabled students. And I think there was a lot of misinformation, perhaps, about the idea that this was being taken away completely initially. I think it's very important to engage in that issue. I've also spoken to local businesses that actually produce assistive software and who accepted that changes were reasonable, that it was totally reasonable to change the approach, given that the cost of computers, the cost of software have changed, but equally were very concerned that particularly for conditions such as dyslexia, assistive software can play a very, very important part. Can you give those groups any confidence that what they will have at the end of the day will be better targeted and will continue to meet their needs?
Well, I can say from an official point of view that this process of consultation to pull out those issues is extremely important in helping us deliver to ministers the best evidence-based advice on what works, in producing an inclusive learning environment for all people with different levels of disability, and making sure they're being handled most effectively and obviously in a most cost-effective way, but with the aim of making sure that people can study effectively. So that's what we're doing, and then we will go back to ministers with those results.
And I mean, on a £5 billion budget for higher education, is a £25 million saving in this area really worth it? If this is an area where, you know, we have rising incidence of people living with long-term conditions and disabilities, and we have you know, a university system which is trying to reach out to those groups, is this really where we need to be making savings?
Well, I think the overriding objective is the one which we share with you, that we don't want, under any circumstances, to create barriers to people with different disabilities doing higher education. And if we do that inadvertently, then that will not be a successful policy. We're trying to target help where it is needed and do it in an appropriate way. I mean, that's the objective of the exercise. But I think we've got past the point, if we were ever at it, of saying, well, 25 million doesn't really matter, we've got to deal with bigger sums. We've had to scrutinise every corner of the department's budget.
Just on that, before we move off, I believe there's considerable evidence to show that students supported by this allowance are actually tend to be higher achievers than the rest, and that in turn will have a long-term economic dividend. Does your evidence and research substantiate that?
I think that's correct, but can you confirm?
I can't directly confirm, but I wouldn't be surprised, given the degree of commitment that people are making. And I think one of the things we're trying to do in this survey, obviously there are financial considerations, but it's trying to make sure that we focus the support where it matters most, rather than simply saying you automatically get this or that. And I think there is a way of actually improving the quality of support we're giving to people who, as you say, then make very good use of it.
Thanks. Can I bring in Anne now around issues surrounding the City Link episode?
I'm sure the department has been following the evidence that our committee and the Scottish Affairs Committee have been taking about the collapse of City Link at Christmas. I just want to clarify just about when and your department was advised about this and how they reacted to it, because we've had some contradictory evidence. I put down a written question to Matthew Hancock, who said that you were advised on the 23rd of December that the company was likely to go into administration on the next day. However, when we took evidence from John Moulton, he said that there was a telephone conversation to a member of BIS on the 18th of December, which was followed up by an email on the 19th of December, but they received silence and nothing came back at all. Could you confirm if that is your understanding, that you were in fact contacted by Better Capital or CityLink's staff prior to the 23rd of December?
Well, the information I was given was, I think, the same information that was given to Mr. Hancock, that the first contact had been with Mr. Moulton telling the department on the 23rd that closure was imminent, and we became deeply engaged from that point on. Okay, so the fact that he says that he could produce an email confirming a phone conversation from the day before on the 19th of December, it just, I mean, given the scale of this collapse and the impact it had on hundreds of workers across the country, I think people might be a bit surprised that if you received an alert on the 18th that, you know, there wasn't an immediate response by the department to actually make sure that you were prepared to help workers. Well, I wasn't aware of that earlier contact, and neither was Mr. Hancock. But once we had been alerted to it, I was, throughout the Christmas New Year period, I was more or less on the phone continually to the people involved in the department and to the trade union, who made regular calls. I think the point that I would emphasise is that at no stage did anybody ever come to the department to discuss a potential rescue operation and to try and involve us in that. The conversation was entirely about an imminent closure and how we could then help the workforce deal with it. Right. so, you know, that was the conversation, and I think we have, with the DWP, with their rapid response unit, dealt with it as effectively as we could have done. I mean, it was a terrible time of year for this kind of problem.
I'm just wondering, if perhaps on that point, if you could just ask how your department and DWP coordinated support, because we had direct evidence from former employees that, in effect, they turned up at the site on the Boxing Day the day after hearing the news on the television, and were handed a kind of badly photocopied piece of paper, and they had no contact from DWP, no contact from the local job centre, which is very unusual given that previous practice is normally that there is a sort of a emergency team put in place who would be at sites to provide advice to workers on the spot, and none of that seemed to have occurred in this case.
The request from ministers, once we were aware of the scale of the problem and the nature of the problem, was that maximum help should be given. I think one of the practical problems which may explain some of the episodes you described was that a lot of the people involved were contractors, officially self-employed, didn't therefore have employee status, and what goes with that. I'm not sure that explains all of the problem, but it may explain some of it.
Right, okay. I mean, have you made any analysis since this incident to see whether there needs to be any improvements, particularly where you have companies which have workers widely dispersed across the country rather than at one or two central sites?
Well, since the operation started, I mean, I have had meetings with the Secretary-General of the TUC and others and she's kept a very close eye on this because it was a major issue, and checked back with our own officials, and people from DWP came across to my department to reassure me that they were properly coordinating it, and I haven't since had any feedback of a negative kind. I think the machine, such as it was at that time of year, did the best it could. Yeah.
Could I just intervene at that point? I mean, on Friday of last week, I actually knocked on the door of a CityLink contractor who had done a considerable amount of work and had not been paid for it, and as far as he could tell, he was going to get very little from the process carried out by the administrators. What comfort, if any, can you offer to the considerable number of contractors in that position?
Well, in terms of our insolvency practice, I mean, they are unsecured creditors. They are unfortunately bottom of the heap, and when a company goes down, such people are in a very disadvantaged position. I mean, next to the people who have the equity, they have little prospect of retrieving their investment, and that is a very sad situation. I mean, I have, when these issues have arisen in the past, I've opened up discussions in the department about should we be changing our bankruptcy insolvency procedures to look at preferred creditor status, fair pack, all those issues have brought that to the fore. But the problem is, if you tilt the balance to one group of creditors, it's at the expense of another, and if there's no more money in the company, then ultimately there are casualties, and it is very sad, and I feel for the people involved, but short of a wholesale change of the law with unintended consequences, I can't actually offer them comfort.
Yeah, I'd like to pursue this, but I'm trespassing on a question I know William wants to ask, so I'll let him do that. But before I do so, Mr. Donnelly, when did you know about CityLink?
I think I was aware round about the same time over Christmas.
Can you put a day to it?
I think not offhand, no. There is a difference between issues which I know our teams are handling about companies which may be moving into difficulty, and then the formal process. And I think it was just before. I can't at this point, I'm afraid, say precisely.
Well, could you inform the committee when, afterwards, if you could check out when basically Better Capital contacted you?
Well, I can certainly check on the point about when there was contact with the department. I just underline the point that at no stage was there a proposal for the government to intervene in any specific...
No, we understand that, but the issues are wider than just that. And that would be helpful to know, and if and when you inform the Minister of that. Could I bring in William now to pursue the line of question that we were covering before?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, when Better Capital acquired CityLink, they said they wanted to pursue an employment model that had only 30% PAYE workers and 70% agency workers. Now, as far as we've been able to determine at the time the company got into severe difficulty, there were around 2,400 people either working or providing services for CityLink, 1,000 of whom were contractors. And as the Chair has said, there have been real concerns expressed, not least by our RMT, that many of these contractors were working in CityLink uniforms, driving CityLink vans. A reasonable person might conclude that they were working exclusively for CityLink. And their view is that this was a form of bogus self-employment that they've been encouraged to go into. Now, these individuals have much less protection when it comes to getting wages back in terms of the Insolvency and Enterprise Acts. So do you now think that there is a very strong and unanswerable case for review of this legislation to meet what is a growing trend in British employment practice?
I think there is a strong case for looking at the employment status you've described. And in fact, before the CityLink issue came up, I had initiated a thorough investigation of employment status, which we're now undertaking. It will be published after this government, but it is now underway, and it is identifying exactly the problem you've described, that there are, under British employment law, there are employees who have certain entitlements, there are workers who have certain entitlements, and there is what appears to be a growing number of people who are not genuinely self-employed, but have, in some sense, fallen through the cracks. And we're trying at the moment to get a handle on what numbers we're talking about, what are the potential gaps in the system, and how, at least through legislation, we might address that problem. But we certainly acknowledge that it exists. And it's a part of this wider debate. I mean, zero-hours contracts was one form of employment status that hitherto not been acknowledged, and semi-self-employment, whatever you choose to describe this, is another. And I think my successor, whoever it is, I would hope takes this seriously, because there is a gap.
Yeah, because this is one of the points really the OECD analysis drew yesterday, which are the sort of challenges for growth in the future are going to be about increasing labour productivity, how you respond to this growth of self-employment in the UK economy. And, the path to sort of sustainable growth isn't, frankly, having the worst excesses of capitalism let rip in this way. It is about having more investment, investing in workforces, investing in skills, having a more productive economy, isn't it?
No, I would agree with that, but I think it's more complicated and multifaceted. I mean, I was in the House 15 years ago when we had the controversies around IR35. You may remember that. It's how people define themselves as self-employed subcontractors, and how independent do you have to be self-employed. So this is, in some ways, this is an old controversy. And part of the ambiguous status that people have in self-employment is something they've chosen to do. If you're, for example, in the offshore oil industry, a lot of people in that twilight area through choice. But there are others who have had it imposed on them because of weak labour market conditions, and I think that's what you're describing.
Okay, can I bring in Mike now on late payments?
Thanks, Chair. Federation of Small Businesses has said that more than half of its members have been paid late by large private companies in the past year. What evidence do you have that the prompt payment code has actually helped SMEs?
Well, we've acknowledged it needs to be strengthened. I mean, we think it has had an impact, but I can't prove that. But we think that a combination of the legislation which you are in the process of passing, which will bring out much more transparency in late payment terms. I think a combination of that and a strengthened code, and we're talking here about 60 days as a binding obligation on signatories to the code, that they will help to improve this practice, which is widespread and, as the FSB and others have pointed out, deeply damaging to many small suppliers.
But how is the sign-up to the code progressing? Because I know that at the time that it was announced, there was a commitment to name and shame FTSE 350 companies that didn't sign up to the code, and that's been rolled back from. So, how well is that progressing in actually getting the bigger companies to sign up to it?
Well, there was a meeting recently in number 10 Downing Street with the various parties trying to draw lessons from the past. I mean, the naming and shaming will happen once parliamentary legislation is passed, because it will be out there and publicly declared what are the terms and conditions which major purchasers offer. So the naming and shaming is implicit in the legislation you are progressing. The code, I think we've all acknowledged, was a good start as an expression of good intentions. It hasn't been as effective as it should have been, because that's why we've come back to you with legislation. And we hope in parallel with the legislation that there will be a stronger code with tougher objectives in terms of payment and sanctions, not legal sanctions because it's a code, but sanctions among signatories in terms of breach.
But is the worry here not that it's only late if it's later than the agreed payment terms, and perhaps the unintended consequences are pushing larger companies towards longer payment terms? I mean, we've seen in the last few months, companies like Tesco's being investigated, but more widely in the food sector, Two Sisters, Premier Foods, Heinz, Cadbury, and even, unfortunately, one in my constituency, Diageo, who are moving their payment terms to longer terms. I mean, Diageo's moved to 90 days. Is that not just a way around late payment if you manage to use your power to move your payment terms to longer periods?
Well, as I've said, my understanding of the revised code, which is under negotiation at the moment, is to set a maximum of 60 days, which is considerably shorter than some of the supermarkets that are now operating. So, clearly you're right that it isn't. They have to set the right standard to be judged against, quite apart from whether they observe the standard. Then I think that's fully understood. Yeah.
Okay. If we can move then to the performance of government in terms of payment terms. The NAO report on late payments looked at 4 government departments, including your own, and looked at how long it was taking to pay invoices, particularly paper invoices, which are used more by SMEs. And the government target, which was announced in 2010, was to pay 80% of undisputed invoices within 5 working days. Now, although BIS are managing to pay 80% by number, it's only 60% by actual value. What can BIS do to meet that target better?
Well, you're right, that's our objective, is 5 working days, and I think there was a distinction between the total value met and the numbers.
Yes.
And we're not so good on the numbers, but we have been good on the value. But
No,
perhaps
it's the
you
other way
can
around.
explain.
But to be fair, the NAO's own analysis, as I understand it, showed that even measured against the value of invoices paid, we did meet the 5-a-day target in 2013-14. Obviously, we want to continue to go further, and we're very pleased that overall we're about 98% on the card. But we do meet that target as well.
Well, I'm not sure that that's the case. It is the case in numbers, but certainly not in value. And I mean, the stats that I have in front of me certainly show that although BIS is managing to do it on numbers, the other three departments, MOD, Home Office and Cabinet Office especially, are lagging a long way behind. And in fact, if you look at the Cabinet Office, at the worst end, there's £68 million worth of invoices that it took more than 30 calendar days to pay, which is a significant proportion of the 196 million total invoiced. So I accept BIS are doing better than other departments, but what can BIS do to try to get that best practice across government as a whole?
Well, I think actually looking at these, I acknowledge there is one area where we need to improve, which is on the speeding up the paper invoice payment. We're at 60, we need to get to 80, and I accept that, and we have a programme to do that. I think across government it is a Cabinet Office lead, so I'm saying we'll do it, so I can only do it through influence, but we will be offering them some advice on how we do it.
Yes, and my straight answer to your question is we have to go on encouraging the Cabinet Office to encourage all main government contractors to sign up to the prompt payment code.
Okay.
There is more we also need to do on procurement to make sure that our bigger contractors are actually passing through the benefits that they're getting from us through to our supply chain, and our visibility of that isn't good enough yet, and we'll work on it.
But you would accept that if government has a need to be the best practice example, we are failing abysmally on that, especially in terms of the Cabinet Office's performance.
Well, I think it's incumbent on BIS to be best practice, and there are a few things we need to do, and we will address those, and I will work with my colleagues to spread this across government.
And there are vast disparities between what government, even sub-performing government, is doing as opposed to some people in the commercial sector.
Okay, thank you.
Can I bring Robin in on the private sector?
Just to follow up on the point that Howard just made actually about the visibility that you have of where the money goes once the government's handed it over to a prime contractor, because it is crucial. Obviously, we're getting the payments through to SMEs out there, and I think I saw an announcement this morning from BIS about 25% of procurement going to SMEs in the future. I'm not sure whether that was across government or from BIS itself. But that's, how do we ensure that we can create that visibility? So that we can make sure that prompt payments are trickling through the whole system, rather than just going from government to a prime contractor and then getting held up.
Well, in terms of this wider question about how you ensure that SMEs get government contracts, what the government has been doing is, greatly simplifying pre-qualification questionnaires, which were the biggest obstacle to people getting into government work. And the legislation, I think it's the Small Business Bill, but certainly one of the bills going through at the moment, extends that practice to the public sector more widely. So the difficulties a lot of SMEs have of selling to hospitals or local councils, they will be subject to the same disciplines that central government's adopted.
But in terms of the prompt payment side of things, and obviously one of the things is government tends to be dealing with larger organisations. I appreciate we're trying to change that, we're trying to make it easier for SMEs to access it. Are there any mechanisms at the moment by which you can hold to account your prime contractors to be prompt payers themselves? Are you, Martin mentioned, I think you're encouraging them to sign up for prompt payment code, but is there any visibility there on how well they're actually performing on it?
How much visibility?
I can only say it has been difficult for ourselves to report how much we're spending with SMEs. It's not something that is typical traditionally, and it has taken us some time to get there. And that's government. So we are asking quite a difficult ask of our contractors, but that is what we will have to do. This will be a long, hard, chipping away process, but I think we will want to be able to say at a not too distant future time that we know the performance of our prime contractors because they'll report it back to us. Mm-hmm. But I do know from a practical point of view it's quite an ask to
It's a complicated thing to do. And is that 25% target, 25% figure in terms of procurement from SMEs, is that just BIS or is that across government?
I think that's a cross-government target. We do better than that. I have somewhere north of 30 in my head, but I don't want to mislead you. But we do beat the target.
Well, perhaps, I mean, if you could write to us just with what the figure is for BIS, I think it would be interesting to see. And
that relates to central government, and of course most of our activities take place through partner organisations, so we have less control over.
Thank you.
William.
There are estimates that half of the UK's bank branches have closed since 1989, and in November you wrote to the banking industry saying that much tougher action had to be taken, particularly where there are proposals to close what might be the last branch left in communities that suffer from either financial exclusion or are in small towns or villages. Now, the industry said it would set up a working group to look into these issues. What's your understanding of how that working group is progressing?
Well, I've had 2 round tables since those comments were made, one just before Christmas and one after. And we had the British Bankers Association, the leading banks, groups representing deprived communities, sort of age concern type bodies, Citizens Advice Bureau, which, and the Federation of Small Business, to try to thrash out a better way of dealing with the last branch in town problem, which is going to become more acute because the banks are, quite reasonably pointing out that technology is moving on fast and they're losing a lot of their mainstream customers at branch level to internet transactions. We are very, very close to reaching an agreement, a code, a concordat, whatever you want to call it. I would hope that within a very short period of time we'll be able to announce what it is. The central idea is that the post office, which partly as a result of the support we've given it, has survived as a branch network, will take on a lot of the financial transactions that bank branches do, and obviously we're currently discussing with them what happens if a bank branch closes in a village and they are not yet themselves equipped to take on the range of functions. So there's a practical issue, but the basic strategy is clear, and very shortly we'll be able to announce a code of conduct.
Can we expect that announcement prior to the dissolution of Parliament?
Yes, certainly. Yeah.
Interesting. And would it require any changes to the post office working practices, any change to legislation at some point?
Well, at this stage we're not talking about legislation, but it will involve changes in the way making the post office more proactive. It is already attracting a significant amount of financial services business. That's a good thing. It's increasing access for people who will otherwise be financially excluded. But taking on a responsibility in a village where, for example, the local traders will be bringing along a big pile of cash at the end of the week. Those are practical problems that we've got to sort out with them.
Okay.
Supplementary.
Yeah, just on that issue, I've had exactly that situation in my own constituency where the last branch in Leon Solent has shut down. There seems to be some confusion with regard to the post office arrangements as to whether they will accept business banking customers, because in one of the places in my constituency the post office has said yes, they will, but in the place where the last branch closed down, they said they wouldn't. Are there any plans to kind of make a sort of slightly more...
one of the central objectives of this agreement that we're trying to reach, and I think we're quite close to reaching, is that it is specifically designed to deal with business customers, small business customers. Because, as you know, in a lot of villages, it's the 2 or 3 remaining shops that keep the village alive. So it is essential that they should be able to perform a basic banking role.
Okay. Can I bring in Mike now on our report on support for business?
Yes. You will be aware that just this week we have launched the report into government support for business. Now, the mid-year review noted that the UK is 8th in the World Bank's ease of doing business ranking, so it's significantly a good ranking, but it does lag further behind in specific measures such as ease of starting a business. Now, would you like to commit to, I don't know whether you've had much of a chance to read the extensive report that came out this week, but there are significant recommendations in there which would help with some of those lower rankings. Are there things in there that you would commit to looking at for the future?
Yes, I've read the summary of your report. I haven't had a chance to digest all of it. I think, let me start with the World Bank ranking. It is 8. I think it's improved from 10 in the last few years. And we do take these indicators seriously. They are a bit arbitrary and they vary from one ranking organisation to another. But yeah, we do benchmark ourselves and regard it as a good test of whether we're doing things right. And there are some areas where we have been very low down the ranking. I think electricity connections was one, and there was a period where land registry was another, but I think that's improving. And the ease of starting up business, I think we were, 30, 40, something like that. It wasn't great, but I think we are conscious of the deficiency, and I think the processes around Companies House have been significantly simplified. We had the objective of, starting a business with a click. I know that's a bit oversimplified, but there are a few standard processes that need to be gone through, of course including 2 sets of tax obligation on the company itself and on employees, and the process has been streamlined, and I would be surprised if it isn't much better when the rankings are redone. But on your report in general, I think my comment would be that it was, a very accurate description of the system as it used to operate. But I think we have now drastically streamlined it, and most businesses are now aware that they can access information through greatbusiness.gov.uk, which is the main portal entry. And the Business Growth Service is now a consolidated advice for growing middle-sized companies, and the Business Bank is now a consolidated system for business finance.
Just intervene at that point, because I have to say the FSB, the Federation of Small Businesses, has given a pretty, I think you describe it as a ringing endorsement of our recommendations, and that would still seem that whatever the progress you feel that you've made in simplifying these processes, there is still a lack of awareness amongst the small business community.
No, I'd spend a lot of time with the FSB in the field and talking to them in head office, and I'm aware of the frustrations a lot of small businesses have because they're very busy and they don't have time to surf the internet looking for what's going. So yes, I'm aware of that at an operational level. In addition to the efforts we're making in the department to make sure that advice, information and finance is available through a simple entry point, what is happening at a local level, which is where lots of small business will look for help, is to support these growth hubs that are now springing up around the country. I was at one recently in Manchester, which I think is one of the more advanced ones, and you have a simple, good office system. Any small business that gets in touch, they will within minutes locate them to the issues that concern them, and they will also get them in touch with a lot of the local schemes, because I think when your committee has been critical of the proliferation of schemes, most of these are local, they're not national. And it's very important that there should be some kind of local growth centre where businesses can grow and be connected to them. So I think the system we've now got is a vast improvement, but it will take time to filter through to every small company.
Yeah. Can I come back to you, Mike, on some elements of
Yes. Well, can I just press you on perhaps 3 specifics that are contained within the report? and see whether we can get any further. I mean, you mentioned about the British Business Bank becoming a one-stop shop for finance, especially alternative finance, and that's welcome. But of course, it's not just about the crowdfunding and other new forms of finance. It's the export guarantees and such like, which don't presently sit within the British Business Bank. But the evidence that we received suggested that it may well be a good place for them to find a home. Secondly, about borrowing powers for the Green Investment Bank, which is something that I've asked you about on numerous occasions. It would be good to have some form of commitment. I mean, the Green Investment Bank have stated they don't need them right now, but they will very shortly, so it would be good to see some sort of commitment to that. And finally, the aspiration or target, and this is the difficulty, of the 1 trillion a year exports. How we could get to a point where there's a committed timeline to actually achieving that, if indeed we are firm in that attempt to achieve it.
Okay, well, the first issue is something we've debated amongst ourselves. There is a question: should you put UK export finance in with the business bank, or leave it where it is? And the argument for leaving it where it is, which has so far prevailed, is that because it's specifically about exports, it should be linked in, synchronised with the work of UKTI, UK Trade and Industry, which is rapidly expanding its access to small, medium-sized companies, and that's the market we are aiming for, because UK export finance, when it was ECGD, I mean, used to be a big business operation. It was tanks and aircraft. It's now targeted much more at SMEs. But the SMEs are much likely to know about it as a result of seeking UKTI advice. So we wanted to pair the two organisations, as it were. That seemed to make sense. But equally, there is an argument for putting it in a business bank, and I can see the arguments for and against. On the borrowing powers of the Green Investment Bank, we have committed ourselves to for this to happen. It's committed. The view of the Green Investment Bank, and I visited the headquarters a couple of weeks ago, is that they have enough capital for the time being. They're doing an impressive job. I think they've disbursed 2 billion or something of that order, with 4 billion of private capital. They will, if they're going to continue with their mandate, need more. And we estimate this will be in 2016. But of course I won't be here, or this government won't be here to assure you that that's delivered, but that is the commitment we've made, and that's what the bank actually needs. On the export target...
Before we move on from that, but 2016, of course, will come before the condition that was set to give
using the
borrowing powers, which is the net deficit having come down.
Yeah.
So is that a commitment then to change government policy that borrowing powers will be given before the previous target was actually met?
Well, I think whoever does this job will have to sort that out with the Treasury. I mean, these net debt objectives are fluctuate over time, as as the economy changes. But certainly our commitment is that it should have borrowing powers, that this is real. And when we reach the next stage of having to mobilise capital, that it should be able to go to capital markets to do it. So that's a very clear objective.
Could I just add on the UK export finance point, as Secretary of State has said, it is something that we've looked at carefully. They have moved a long way with 3 new products specifically focused at small firms. We've also got joint work between UKTI, the British Business Bank, and UK Export Finance as to how they can function effectively together. But we do need, for international comparison reasons, to keep a ring fence around export credit facilities because of all the international agreements we've signed up in to avoid unfair competition in this area. So it does mean that you have to treat UK Export Finance slightly separately as an organisation. The challenge, as Secretary has said, is to make sure that we focus it effectively with UKTI on the needs of small firms. And I think we're making progress.
And I think your last point was about the £1 trillion target. We're clearly not meeting that at the moment. I don't know whether Lord Livingstone's ever been in front of your committee, but he's done a lot of number crunching and came out with the interesting conclusion that a lot of the underperformance is due to some rather strange things that are happening with gold and diamonds, which apparently account for a very large part of both exports and imports, and fluctuations in these affect the numbers. But the basic story on exports is that we're doing exceptionally well with very large volume and sterling value growth in big emerging markets like China, less extent India, but many of the other big emerging markets in quite spectacular growth. But we have very poor figures in Western Europe for reasons that are understandable, and the combination of the two is below that objective. I think it's perfectly reasonable to continue to be ambitious, because if the rebalancing of the economy is going to happen, it's going to come through trade, and we must therefore have an ambitious objective. Whether we're able to reach it will partly depend on sustaining the momentum behind these emerging market promotional work that we do, which is very energetic. There's some good things happening. Partly depends on things like the exchange rate that are beyond our control and are currently difficult.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks. In response to your comment earlier, yes, we had Lord Livingstone before the committee, but it was essentially on the TTIP negotiations rather than the support for industry. You mentioned gold and diamonds, but didn't really elaborate, perhaps for a very good reason on how it affected the figures. Would you be able to send the committee some sort of...
I mean, what it has done,
effectively,
it's a strange phenomenon that export growth has been substantially weakened without deterioration in the trade deficit, because it affects imports and exports at the same time. It's entrepreneur trade in these very valuable substances. But we can send you a technical...
I think that would be helpful. Can I bring in Caroline now on red tape?
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, I want to talk about the red tape challenge. The department states that it's continued to deliver benefits to business by achieving 10 of the 30 recommendations of the Prime Minister's EU red tape task force. I just wondered what happened to the other 20 recommendations.
I can't tell you off the cuff. I mean, we do know that a large amount of superfluous regulation has been scrapped. And I think we'd estimated £2 billion worth of cost has been saved through that process. But I think one of the things which has emerged from the red tape challenge, I think, which is quite important, is that I think when initially we had long lists of regulation, and business groups were invited to say, how does this affect you? One of the things we discovered was that it wasn't so much the number of regulations, but it was the way in which the regulatory agencies themselves functioned, and that we now have a system whereby there is a prime organisation. If you're trying to trade across the country, and every local council has a different approach to regulation, you can go through one, which is a designated regulator, and that will apply to all the others, and you basically cut out an awful lot of duplication. So the way the red tape challenge has evolved is in ways we didn't quite expect, but is actually qualitatively extremely valuable.
If I could just offer one example of that we came across this week. There's a bakery chain who were struggling with the question of when they had to provide lavatory facilities in their shops. And the question was, if you had one table and chairs, did that require facilities, or if you had 6 or 20 people? And the lead regulator, I think in this case a council in the northeast, gave a decision which is now applied across the country, so we don't have to go through the process everywhere, and it does make a big difference.
So is it possible that someone can maybe just drop us a line to let us know which of the recommendations have been achieved and what the ones are that are...
In the European Union context, yes, we can certainly do that. I'd just add that the December European Council, and we know that things in Europe can take a little longer than one would like sometimes, has actually explicitly agreed that there should be a reduction in the regulatory burden overall, with First Vice President Timmermans playing a very active role and in discussion with ministers in the UK, we do have a real sense of focus on this issue in the new European Commission.
Good, I think we'd all agree with that. This is quite a demanding question, and I don't know whether you'll have this number to hand, but have you got any idea how many regulations that you've introduced this year compared to how many that you've removed?
Well, we don't sort of count regulations, we count their cost to business. That's the 1 in 2 out system. Doesn't mean that you remove 2 regulations for every one. We get these experts in the Regulatory Policy Committee, as it's called, to do a cost-benefit calculation, and the costs are then offset against outs, as we call them, and I think we're pretty confident that the basic objective of achieving balance will be achieved.
Can I just follow that up? Because you do have a policy of, it used to be 1 in, 1 out, now it's 1 in, 2 out, yeah. I understand. I'm not quite sure how you can implement that policy without actually having a record of the actual regulations that you've abolished.
Well, we do, yes. I mean, there is an annual report published on...
I thought I had seen it in
it does exist, and it's all quite transparent.
Yeah. Could you send the details to the
we can give
committee?
You the latest update. As the Secretary of State said, we do it in terms of financial impact, but we'll let you have those details.
Yeah. Could I just follow on something that you touched on in response to Caroline, and that is basically about the implementation of regulations. And I mean, everybody's familiar with the so-called gold plating of EU regulations, and it does seem to, as political representatives, odd that other EU countries seem to be quite happy to be able to live with a certain regulatory regime that we're told by British business affects them substantially and adversely in comparison to other European countries. Has the processes that you put in place about the implementation of regulations done anything to mitigate that particular problem?
Yes, we do feel we have stopped gold plating. I mean, there's quite a lot of kind of myth in this area. Mm-hmm. I mean, most of the league tables that I've seen about member countries' implementation of European legislation and regulation is that we're about mid-table. We're not, uber diligent, and that's, probably about right. And we have been very active in trying to ensure that the Commission itself pursues better practice, and that's the discussion we're having with Mr. Timmermans. But there aren't many examples, screaming about where, we in the UK have pursued far more diligent, intrusive, costly forms of regulation than emerged from the Commission. Where they've happened, we've tried to deal with them.
Okay. Robin.
Thank you, Chairman. The Science and Innovation Strategy was published in December, and it was greeted by CASE, the Campaign for Science and Engineering, as reassuring but not exciting or overwhelming, I think the word was. Secretary of State, you were quite effusive earlier about saying about the value of investment in science and R&D and the need for the UK to catch up in that space. I mean, do you regret the fact that there isn't a specific commitment to ring-fence the budget going forward yet? And do you feel that it's something that obviously, whilst the revenue budget has been protected over the last 4 years, it looks like the capital budget has actually declined, and that's in contrast to the BIS budget in general, where capital expenditure has increased. Do you feel that's an area where we are falling back further?
Well, we did obtain a significant slug of science capital last year. I can't remember whether it was the budget or the autumn statement, but that has been agreed, and that has reversed the phenomenon you've described. I mean, the science community make the obvious point that a lot of their laboratories are substandard and they need replacing. This isn't necessarily glamorous, big new projects, but it needs doing, and there has to be capital spending on research for exactly the reasons you imply. But in terms of the basic strategy, the point that I emphasise is that although the science budget, which is kind of blue skies university science, has been protected and ring-fenced, this has not been true historically of the innovation budget, which is the point at which R&D gets into business. And I think we've done, even though I say myself, I think really good work in building up a good innovation program through the Catapult network. That is not protected, but I think the case for it is a very compelling one, and it does depend on co-financing with business and universities.
And that leveraging of the public sector investment in this area, and how do you feel? Is there any way of measuring the performance in that, in terms of the amount of private sector investment going into those catapult centres, going into those collaborations alongside the public sector?
Well, it can and is measured in particular instances. We had what turned out to be a very successful programme in university campuses where the government offered 50-50 for capital investment in research facilities, and that was an extremely popular programme and attracted a lot of very good university bids. As far as the catapults are concerned, we have a 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, where it's sort of universities, government and the private sector, but the proportion varies. In some cases, like the advanced manufacturing catapult, where there is enormous take-up by business and real enthusiasm, I think they've got beyond 1/3, but there will be, one of the tricky issues going forward with the spending review is how to sustain that programme, bearing in mind the government contribution.
Okay, finished. All right. Can I just come on to the Tomlinson report, Minister? I know you've had evidence put to you by representatives of failed businesses. Indeed, I've had the same evidence put to me by some of the same businesses. And the Tomlinson report did suggest that some of the major clearing banks have been deliberately engineering defaults in companies in order to make money from fees or devalued assets. And certainly, I know that you have been sympathetic to some companies that have appeared to have suffered this. What evidence have you got that these practices have changed following the Tomlinson investigation into this?
Well, let me go back a bit. I think I would just acknowledge and praise the work that Mr. Tomlinson did. He was our first entrepreneur in residence, or the first of two, and I encouraged him to pursue the line of inquiry which he did, and he produced this report which we gave to the Financial Conduct Authority. I'm not sure that they have yet completed their work. I think in some cases there was a discussion about whether this merited intervention by the Fraud Office. I don't know where that got to. Whenever I have met the leading banks, I've challenged them to assure me that these practices don't continue. I'm meeting Mr. McEwen actually later today, and I know that RBS have actually closed down the unit that was the centre of a lot of these allegations. I think certainly that's the case in Lloyds too, but the FCA are the body that is actually following this on a constant basis.
Yes, can I follow this? Because I know that the representatives of some of these businesses have approached the FCA, and the feeling they're getting, and I actually think it's probably correct, that they're being passed from pillar to post, and they've got very genuine grievances which reflect practices which may in some cases have been illegal, but absolutely nothing is being done about it, and they have no means of personal redress. And when you think of past, PPI scandals and so on and so forth, something has been put in place to actually compensate the individuals concerned from the consequences of these particular working practices by the banks. But here you've got businesses that may have had employees that have led to individuals being made bankrupt, purely and simply on the face of it, because of the banks deliberately foreclosing them. Could the department make representations to actually have some sort of appeal processing, investigatory process carried out in order that companies and individuals who've been affected like this could actually have them investigated, a decision made, and at least feel there has been some sort of redress from the various government institutions that are supposed to basically support business?
Well, I will certainly ask the Financial Conduct Authority where they currently are with those investigations. I think they do relate to events 5-6 years ago, sometimes longer. Yeah. Most of them relate to activities in the commercial property market and specific, where, of course, conditions have now changed. But I think it is, we do need to find out what happened to those investigations. I know the bank denied them, or some of the banks denied them, but I will ask the regulator where they currently stand.
Thank you. I would welcome a copy of the responses that you get on that. Just coming on to the role of the Insolvency Service in general, and indeed we're going to have a session on this, and ideally I would like to have had it before questioning you, but anyway. What do you see as the key role of the Insolvency Service, and what are the outcomes that you judge its success against?
Well, I mean, the key role of the Insolvency Service is in managing failure of companies. And as far as, I think the key test of it would be how far it's able to keep the good bits of companies going as, preferably as going concerns, to give an opportunity for companies to be relaunched. That's a key objective. Another is to ensure that if a company does go down, that there is a fair, transparent system of allocating the remaining assets. Those are its main objectives. But as you know, because Parliament's been dealing with it, there is legislation going through at the moment to reform insolvency practice, particularly since there are, I think, 6 or 7 different regulators, to ensure that there is a much clearer, less ambiguous system of regulatory responsibility. There's also been an attempt to look at insolvency practitioners' charges. We did a report into that, and the follow-up to it is in the legislation that you currently have. So I know it's a contentious area, and particularly having been through a very traumatic recession, there's been much more focus on that service than was the case in the past. But right. Anything to add to that?
No, I think it's also the case that we're seeking to use digital services increasingly for insolvency, as well as other services like Companies House. So we're trying to move the organisation through an important transformation.
Well, I think William would like to just pursue one of these issues now.
This is in terms of HMV, isn't it, Chair? Yeah. Okay. Yes, earlier this month it was reported that the administrator and advisors working on HMV's administration could be taking up to £19 million in fees, whilst the government, via the Pension Protection Fund, would be left to plug the gaps in HMV's pension fund. Does this indicate that there's a failure in the current approach to managing insolvencies?
Well, the very large fees raise the question about how fees are determined and whether they are fair or exorbitant, and it was on that basis that I asked, I think, Elaine Kempson, who is a professor at Bristol, to do a review of fee setting by insolvency practitioners in order to establish whether this was really. She's come up with a variety of recommendations for improving practice. I think the kind of sums that you are describing arise when cases are big and complex, and of course if a professional firm is billing at so much an hour, very large sums rack up quickly, and that's all the more reason for having a procedure that is quick and efficient.
Okay, right. Can I bring in Paul now on student loans and other aspects of higher education?
Thanks very much, Chair. Obviously, Secretary of State, you'll recall the report that we published on student loans last July, in which we expressed serious concerns about the sustainability of the system and asked you to review the situation as a department. Have you done so?
We're constantly reviewing it, but we've never accepted the premise of your argument that there's a problem of sustainability. I think there's a lot of focus on the so-called RAB charge, which has very, very little meaning in the real world. It's got no connection whatever with what government spends. It's got no connection with government's net asset position. It is a projection of what the position might be when I'm 105 years old. I may still be doing the job, but it's improbable. And it's a projection which is actually, I think, to 2048-49, based on, I think, 3 years of base data. And you know, the RAB charge can go up and it can go down. I mean, it's an exercise we have to do. You know, clearly the government has to make some kind of estimate of potential default on its loans, but it has no operational significance whatever. And we take the view, and I believe this very strongly, and it's a view that has recently been confirmed by the OECD, that we actually have the most sustainable system of funding within the OECD, because universities are properly funded. Students now have a progressive graduate tax type repayment system, and unlike almost every other bit of society that depends on the public sector funding, universities are in extraordinarily good financial shape overall.
It's curious that the importance that you place on the RAB charge has declined in inverse proportion to the estimate of the RAB charge.
I never attached importance to it.
Well, your university ministers at an early stage in the debate put great stress on the fact that the RAB charge, in demonstrating the sustainability of the system, that the RAB charge would be less than 30%, then it was going to be 32%. There was contemptuous dismissal within robust debate of a suggestion by HEPI that it might be 40%, and now we know it's 45%. And I'm puzzled. I'm not an economist like you, Secretary of State, but I'm kind of puzzled by this idea that we should casually disregard an estimate of a future cost on the public purse, because that's what we're talking about, isn't it?
Yes,
money that is lent and not repaid is going to be a cost, whether it's when you're 105 or even younger.
Well, it isn't supposed to be a self-financing scheme. It is a progressive repayment system akin to a form of graduate tax, and the fact that it is not repaid is not because people are defaulting. It's because we have quite deliberately said that low-earning graduates shouldn't repay. And that's, you know, it's the principle of income tax. You wouldn't look at income tax thresholds 30 years down the line and say this isn't sustainable because people have been lifted out of tax. That would be a weird way to look at it. But trying to apply treating this entirely as if it is a self-financing loan scheme, which it isn't, I think misses the point of what we're trying to achieve, which is that it is a quite deliberate act of policy to subsidise graduates on low incomes who cannot pay.
I fully accept that, Secretary of State, but the deliberate act of policy was that the cost of that subsidy was going to be below 30%. You're now calculating it at 45%, and in a previous session that we had with officials and the previous university minister acknowledged you were modelling it at over 50%. I mean, aren't our concerns also reflected in the National Audit Office report of the previous year, which said basically you need to get your modelling better as a department?
Well, to the extent to which we would take the RAB charge seriously, then it obviously needs to be modelled as well as possible. I mean, the reason I get quite, you may think I'm getting quite aggressive in my reply on it, is the way that this is willfully misunderstood. Because the government doesn't have to set aside any money to cover this RAB charge. It is a purely theoretical construct and has no operational relevance. But in terms of its changing value, The reason why the RAB charge has risen, or the estimate of the RAB charge has risen, is for several reasons. I mean, one is that we've had a period of below average real earnings growth, and extrapolating it into the future will produce an estimate of yield, which of course may change if the trajectory of the economy changes. The whole calculation is based on assumptions about discount rates and interest rates, which may radically change in future. I mean, it is, as you say, and a key reason is that because we're expanding university education, have lifted number controls, more and more people are getting an opportunity to have higher education, it's quite likely that we will have more people who are graduated who are not at sort of top premium rates of salary. So that's another factor. But that is a progressive policy development and not something I think we need to be worried about or apologise for.
Let me then ask you about another part of your oversight in this area, which probably doesn't fall within the context of progressive policy, which is the Public Accounts Committee report yesterday, which indicated that it's concerned about the way that the department had completely lost control of the amount of money that was going to support students in private sector institutions. And I think you'd probably agree that their conclusion that BIS had no clue how much of the 1.27 billion paid out of the public purse, no clue how much of proportion that had been lost to fraud or waste, is a fairly devastating conclusion, and relates again to just how far the department's got a grip on these issues.
Well, I think unlike your first issue, which I'm dismissing as a non-problem, this is a real problem, and I acknowledge it. It is a real issue because it involves real money now in institutions and taxpayers' funding, and we therefore take it extremely seriously. But if I can go back to why this situation has arisen, the view the government took at the beginning of our higher education reforms were that there were alternative providers out there who were known to be of very high quality and who should therefore be brought, you talk about the University of Law and institutions of that kind, and who therefore should be brought within the higher education funding system. There was also a wish, which I think was entirely understandable, to see experimentation, that instead of conventional university courses to have shorter foundation degree level HNC, HND, BTEC level courses provided for people who didn't want the full university course, and we wanted to encourage providers to come in and provide that type of course. And actually, if you look at skill shortages, it's often around technician level, which is HNC, HND equivalent. So there was a need for this type of provision. What's happened was that there was a very rapid growth in this sector, much of it of high quality, some of it of very poor quality. We've realised that as the situation has evolved. There have been a small number of cases of abuse, and they are now being discussed. I mean, the Guildhall, ICE, and others, they're out there in the public domain. As soon as I became aware of the rapid growth and the risk of abuse, we initiated a very thorough investigation of the sector.
Can I just ask at what point that was?
I think there were a series of trigger points, but I certainly recall during 2013 the combination of very rapid growth and the concern about students who perhaps shouldn't have been in those schools.
Could I ask why you only became aware of the rapid growth in 2013? I mean, I've got a copy of a piece from the Times Higher, which reports the risk of this growth in 2012. It was
correct.
It was July 2012. Yes. Serious piece in the Times Higher saying rapid growth. The Roger King, who was visiting professor at the University of Bath, said it's a matter of enormous concern to the taxpayer, and you weren't aware of it until a year later.
I was aware of rapid growth, and actually, because of the growth factor, we did in 2012 initiate a process of establishing number controls, precisely for that reason. and there was a public consultation launched as to how we establish number controls for 13-14 based on a lower base level. So that problem was already being taken into account. There was no suggestion at that stage that there was the kind of abuse that you've referred to. That came later.
But shouldn't the rapid growth in an unknown sector with new players have led to greater scrutiny from within the department? And because there wasn't that scrutiny, we've got the situation with the Public Accounts Committee reported that you had no idea why 20% of students in the alternative provider sector hadn't signed up to do any exams.
Well, that kind of abuse became evident at a later stage, and we jumped on it very promptly once we were aware of it. But the idea that the rapid growth of higher education is a bad thing was not how we started. I mean, as you know, the government does not have detailed oversight of higher education institutions. I mean, you know, universities and FE colleges providing HE are independent bodies and who do not operate directly under government control, and that's one of the strengths of the British system. And the alternative providers were being opened up into that space. So the fact that there was growth was not surprising, but for quite obvious prudential reasons, once the pace of growth became apparent, we initiated the process of number control, which is the 2012 exercise. It was, I don't remember the date in 2013, but I remember the conversation with the Permanent Secretary when we began to become alarmed by some of the things that were happening. The process of expansion was stopped summarily until we had investigated the malpractices that were undoubtedly occurring in some of the colleges.
And we did set up in 2013 a cross-departmental team to do this investigation, including our internal audit and using other departments' expertise. And we've progressively tightened the quality processes since then. So having produced a cap to make sure that we continue to be able to finance the growth, we've been continuing as more evidence has become available of which colleges were delivering good quality facilities and which appeared not to be, to focus down and to make sure that we were checking those more rigorously, and we've continued to do so, to make sure that the quality of the course itself is validated, that the providers passed a QAA quality review, and that the finance and governance of all the providers passed an assessment by our department on the advice of the Higher Education Funding Council.
Can I just ask you, Mr. Donnelly, I mean, given that we saw that kind of quadrupling of designated courses in a 12 to 18 month period back in the earlier years of this Parliament, what extra processes did you put in place as a department to ensure money was being well spent at that time? It was a significant development in the sector.
Well, it's happened step by step. As I said, in 2012, the process of number controls came in. The Minister of State published a written ministerial statement summarising, I think, 10 steps that we have now taken, and they've come in one after the other, depending on feasibility. That was in, I think, beginning of this year. So there is a very, very comprehensive framework now for dealing with this problem, but it's coming incrementally.
I appreciate, Secretary of State, that there is now what I was trying to get to with my question to Mr. Donnelly was, given that this was a significant policy departure to encourage the growth in the alternative provider sector, given that there was very substantial growth, given that a number of independent people were giving warnings of the cost of the public purse, how did the department anticipate the consequences? Now, how has it caught up with itself subsequently?
Perhaps I could make 2 points, and we can send you a timeline of the different steps that we took over the past 3 years, because as the Secretary of State said, this was a step-by-step process. It was very rapid growth. It was also from a very low base, from about 7,000, and we're now, as you know, in the 50 to 60,000. So the first step that we took was to make sure that we had capped the growth in the largest providers as soon as that information became available, and we'd gone through the necessary processes. We then continued to tighten up the quality appraisal. We made all the institutions come back and be reviewed to check on the quality of their courses, and we've progressively increased the levels which they have to achieve to do that, and we've done that over the last 18 months. We continue to do that. There was a further announcement in January, and we're looking again at what more we need to do. So I think the essential story is, as the evidence became available, we made sure that we were capping the financial cost within our budgets, and we were then checking the quality of the course, the quality of the provider, using the existing facilities that we've got with the Higher Education Funding Council and others, but also focusing particularly on those who had grown most rapidly.
Okay. Can I just conclude this this thing with just one question? I mean, the Public Accounts Committee said that you have no idea, as a department, how much of the 1.27 billion paid out to private providers has been lost in fraud or waste. Is that true?
Well, we're narrowing down the calculations as we work through the problems, but the overwhelming, I mean, we're talking about over 100 institutions which have grown up from a handful. As far as we can assess, there are very serious question marks over a handful of them. The vast majority are bona fide, providing a good service which young people are perfectly happy to pay for, and they, claim as appropriate grant and maintenance loans, or fee loans in some cases. And I don't think anybody questions that the vast amount of that public support has been subject to all the proper processes. Where it hasn't been, I think there are two different problems which have been conflated. One is that there have been undoubtedly cases where the box ticking, the form filling, has not been done properly. For example, Pearson, the company that oversees the certification process, was allowing people to go forward and make claims, and they weren't registered until they actually did the exam. They probably should have been registered right at the beginning, and that was a lapse of procedure, but it wasn't in any way suggesting that it was waste or fraud. Where we have suspected fraud, and there have been some cases, or people, claiming, people from Southern Europe in some cases who've come into courses, they haven't met the residency qualification and they claimed grants. We're now trying to retrieve that from them. So that there is a tiny amount of that total sum which was improperly spent, and we're trying to retrieve it.
Okay. Can I just ask one final question, which is actually reverting to the previous points in terms of practicalities of uncollectible debt. In our report last year, we recommended a change of culture in the student loans company to tighten up the collection regime. How far have you implemented any change in that area, and what results have we seen in the subsequent 7 months?
Well, the student loan company in general has performed well in both the disbursement of loans and the collection. If you remember, I think roughly about the time we came into office, it went through a profound crisis, a simple inability to deliver, and all kind of improved management systems are put in place, and it has performed much better as a company, and we're satisfied with its performance. We've had no major difficulties with getting loans out to students. In terms of collection, they have been tough. We've been accused in some cases of they've been accused of being too tough. Some of the alternative provider students, for example, who have gone after, they've had bailiffs appearing at the door. So it's not, not lack of diligence, and the fact the student loan company have been accused of being over-energetic in reclaiming its funding rather than the opposite.
And we've doubled the resource that's being spent on chasing up loans which are overdue, whether in the UK or in the European Union, or indeed more widely, using the latest techniques to do that. And the SLC do have a focused team working full-time on that.
What success have you had, particularly with collection from those studying abroad? Because that was a theme of our report, and we contrasted the effectiveness of that with, for example, the United States, who are pretty good at collecting fees, debt from their students who move abroad.
Well, it's quite early days yet, because quite a lot of the students, of course, are only just beginning to graduate and move. It's also the case that quite a lot of the students working in Europe are actually British, who go abroad for some years and then come back. And we make sure that we have very clear processes for contacting them, for staying in contact with them, and for making sure that as and when they return, we also use the processes here. And we're looking at bilateral agreements with various European countries so that we can collect each other's debt more or less automatically. So the system is working. It's more challenging in the European Union than it is in the UK, but there is a strong legal framework which supports us collecting that debt, and we make very clear that we expect it to be paid, and we go after people who fall into arrears, sometimes for understandable reasons.
Well, I think the question you raise is a very important one, because it actually gets to the heart of the controversy which you initiated, which is, I mean, some people often say to me that since you have a kind of student graduate tax system, why don't you just do the whole hog and have a graduate tax, and instead of trying to pretend that you're doing a loan scheme. And one of the main reasons is because of overseas students from Europe, because we have, under a contractual arrangement, we can claim back the money. If it were a tax system, we would have no basis for claiming it back, because there's no common tax policy. So although we're only talking about 10% or less of the student intake, that is in a way is the hinge on which the system swings.
I'm tempted, but I won't enter into that wider debate. Thank you.
Just before we leave that subject, coming back to the PAC report and the alternative providers, I mean, you've outlined the steps that you've taken in dealing with this particular problem, but the fact remains that a substantial amount of public money appears to be lost, and there does appear to have been at least an element of fraud in the system. What do you feel in hindsight you did wrong, or perhaps should have done but didn't, when this was set up?
Well, I would, as I've already done with Paul Blomfield, I'd sort of question the premise that vast amounts of money has been lost. I don't think it has. I mean, the people have done courses, got higher national qualifications. You may take the view that these colleges are not performing, Oxbridge.
Well,
Imperial
I'm just
College
going by the
level
PAC report.
But it's, I think we wouldn't accept the premise that large sums have been lost. There has been some, and there has been some fraud, without doubt. And we are now pursuing that as aggressively as possible. But I think once you liberalise a system, which is what we've done, and you allow or indeed encourage a lot of new companies, which is what they are, to come in and provide a service, you can't totally predict in advance how the market is going to respond, and that's the situation we're dealing with. It's not universities in general, and alternative providers in particular, are not directly controlled by government, and we don't want them to control them.
I think the figure given by the PAC is 20 million. Is that correct? Is my memory correct on that?
In terms of fraud?
Yeah, or lost money.
This is a complex area, and there will be another discussion with the PAC, as you know, later in March. One of the issues is about the level of dropouts of students, and clearly whether in alternative providers or in, if you like, the more traditional sector, some students, those who are older, those who have family responsibilities, those with coming from less prosperous backgrounds, tend to have a higher dropout rate. The fact that they drop out does not mean that they won't then return to study later or follow some alternative course. So there is an issue about whether you consider dropout rates in themselves to be a sign of misused funding. I don't think it's as simple as that, and therefore there's a question of what you put into these figures. But the actual figure for fraud in terms of people who have been proven to apply for funding to which they're not entitled is much smaller than that.
Yeah. I mean, will you be responding to the PAC?
We will be providing further information to the PAC over the next week or so in advance of that hearing.
Right. Could we have a copy of that, and we will examine Can I bring in Robin on business rates?
Yes, thank you. One of the key recommendations of our report on the high street and the future of the high street and retail was for a root and branch reform of business rates, and clearly we have that in the offing. The machinery of government means that a lot of that decisions on that will sit with the Treasury or with CLG. But what role is BIS playing in advocating what would be a better system for business?
Well, I've certainly advocated in government and publicly that the business rate system needs to be reformed, and I've encouraged the business groups to come up with coherent alternatives. I mean, one of the problems is there are different views about how you reform it, inevitably the case. We have certainly pressed to have an extension of business rate relief for small traders, and that the Treasury has been very helpful in continuing that. I think as we look forward, there are two levels on which reform is being considered. I mean, one are the fairly, limited changes working within the current system. I think there's a good case for saying let's have annual revaluations. I mean, that does involve, of course, more bureaucracy to do the valuation, but it would help companies, business traders particularly, to keep abreast of rent changes so they're not faced with massive, painful revaluations. But equally, there are much more ambitious proposals about doing away with the whole system and replacing it with taxes on turnover or site value or whatever. I think it would help if the main business groups were to collectively come up with an alternative which is tax neutral, because I doubt that the Treasury would look at any other set of options, and which is consistent amongst themselves. And that's a bit of a difficult task, but I think that's where we should be heading.
But can this department actually help to collect
yes,
that and encourage that engagement?
We have a unit that does work on business taxation, and certainly they brief me and they work with the business groups to try and help clarify new ideas.
Right, I've got about 3 questions I want to finish off with, all on totally different subjects. First of all, when you restructured Royal Mail and the post office prior to the sell-off, you said that the post office was set to become a mutual. That particular ambition seems to have disappeared. What has happened? What progress has been made, if any?
Well, it hasn't disappeared, but it hasn't been realised, and that's because, by definition...
No, that's a very subtle distinction, if I may say so.
Well, maybe it's a distinction that's solved if you introduce the word yet. And I mean, clearly a mutual, by definition, involves the consent of the postmasters, postmistresses, and that we're working with them. It wasn't the first priority, because the first priority was to stabilise the network, which we've done. I think we're now in a remarkable period. We've actually got more outlets than we inherited, which goes very much against the historic trend. And the post office network is going through a transformation process and modernisation, including performing financial services. So that's taken priority. I would say that overall the post office network is actually one of our success stories, but mutualisation hasn't yet been achieved.
Okay. I think you're saying very little. I realise that 1 or 2 need to get to questions. Secondly, international students. According to a report yesterday, our share of the world market has dropped from 36% 3 or 4 years ago to 32.5% now. What do you think are the reasons for that?
I think it's disappointing. I think there are several reasons. One is that some of the competitor countries, if we call them that, which is US, Canada and Australia, are more aggressively competing for these students, whereas the focus in the UK has been more on the potential abuses to the system and introducing restrictions. We don't, of course, have a cap on overseas students, but the visa requirements are more testing than they used to be, because there was some genuine abuse. But as you know, because I've told your committee before, I certainly regard overseas students as a bonus to the economy, something we should be trying to encourage, providing they're bona fide. I think there are one or two particular features of the system which I would like to see looked at again, which would make us a more attractive destination. The study to work route is open, but is quite testing in terms of the time periods and the salary levels required, and I think some students find other countries more accommodating in that respect. I think probably the biggest problem, if I'm frank with you, is the rhetoric. That's if you're in the Indian subcontinent, you hear a lot of very negative rhetoric from the UK. This is less true in China, where our numbers have grown very rapidly.
And taking students out of immigration statistics?
Well, it would be a rational thing to do because students are not immigrants. But the reason why they're not, as I understand it, is that there is a United Nations Convention which defines anybody who comes into the country for more than a year.
But other countries have managed to do it.
They have, and I would...
So I'm concerned because I know we've got Scottish members who need to get into Scottish questions.
I think that would be an advance if we could achieve that.
Okay. My last question, very quickly. I think in 2004 you had advocated the abolition of the Biz Department. Well, as you've been Minister for 5 years, what changed your mind?
Well, it's a totally different department. I mean, in 2004, it was the Department of Trade and Industry. I think a lot of its work was about energy, which is now done somewhere else. And it's now, we now have universities, FE colleges, science, which were not in the department before. It's a fundamentally different department. But I have changed my mind in the sense that I think an active industrial policy of the kind we now have through the industrial strategy, which I was highly sceptical about a decade ago, I think is right, and I think has been vindicated by the work we've done.
Thank you, Minister. And on that note, we'll leave it. And once again, reiterate what I said before. Thank you for all your assistance in our inquiries over the years. Good luck. And order.